And we have more breaking news now. This from the Wall Street Journal, confirming a question just raised before we went to this commercial break. The Wall Street Journal is reporting tonight that David Pecker, the chairman of American Media Incorporated, which publishes the National Enquirer, provided prosecutors with details about payments Mr. Cohen arranged with women who alleged sexual encounters with President Trump, including Mr. Trump's knowledge of the deals. Joining our discussion now, Barbara McQuade, a former federal prosecutor. She's a professor of law at the University of Michigan, an MSNBC legal contributor. Harry Litman, former federal prosecutor and deputy assistant attorney general under President Clinton. And Ron Klain is with us, a former senior aide to President Obama and a former chief counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I saw David Cay Johnston there, but someone left him out of my little teleprompter here. David Cay Johnston, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who is running the organization DCReport.org, which studies the Trump investigation. Barbara McQuade, first to you, this information just reported by the Wall Street Journal that David Pecker, who was clearly identified in yesterday's proceeding of Michael Cohen's guilty plea, is now, it's confirmed by the Wall Street Journal, he is already cooperating with the prosecutor and had already cooperated with the prosecutor before they even made that presentation yesterday, which seems to make sense when you read every part of that presentation.
Yeah, this is very significant news, I think, because I think one of the skepticisms of what Michael Cohen had to say is just, he's talking out of his own self-interest. You would need to corroborate what he's saying with other witnesses. And now to have David Pecker, someone who is speaking against his own self-interest, to have provided that information, I think is strongly corroborative. And if, as you said, he implicates President Trump as well, this is really a huge development. It's not just Michael Cohen with an axe to grind, trying to save his own skin. It's now corroborated by two witnesses. And chances are they've got documentation that supports that as well. So very significant piece of news there. And
Ron Klain, President today, telling Fox News something kind of vague about his knowledge of the payments. When he was asked about, did you know about the payments, he said later. We have no idea what that was supposed to mean. But here's David Pecker, according to the Wall Street Journal, saying that President Trump was part of arranging the payments and that President Trump had knowledge of the deals and knowledge of the deals being arranged.
That's right, Lawrence. I think your introduction made such an important point, which is we know so much more about this today than we did yesterday. But to paraphrase the old pop song, but not half as much as we're going to know tomorrow. I mean, but Robert Mueller knows a lot of things we don't know yet. Thousands, tens of thousands of pages from Michael Cohen's office, months of investigation. It's starting to come to light now. The scope of it is really quite stunning, but there's still a lot here we don't know. All we do know is it's going to point in a very bad direction for the president. He clearly lied to the American people. He clearly, lied to anyone who he talked to about it. And we now have two witnesses corroborating the fact that he directed people to commit a crime. That's a very serious piece of business with a lot of unknown stuff still out there.
David Cay Johnston, you've been following Donald Trump and his circle for longer than any of us. I think the easiest prediction you could have made for us tonight is that, of course, David Pecker is going to cooperate with federal prosecutors. The Wall Street Journal has beat us to even making it as a prediction. They've got it as already underway.
Well, and the other people are going to step forward now. Donald's always been able to beat back law enforcement, beat back grand juries, compromise people, get people to do corrupt things in the government to advance his interests. And now all these other people, understanding that Donald Trump is only loyal to Donald, are going to start abandoning him. And this is a dangerous time for our country because Donald's erratic behavior is likely to become much, much more erratic. He's going to have a lot of internal conflict over this because, remember, in his delusional mind, he is greater than all of us. We're idiots. We're stupid. We don't know. And he is the superior person.
And Harry Litman, in the material revealed by the prosecutor yesterday, we saw a description of members of the Trump campaign, unnamed members of the Trump campaign, as full participants in this criminal conspiracy for these illegal campaign contributions to be made. And I think we have every reason to believe tonight that they are at least under as close scrutiny as David Pecker is from the prosecutors, and whoever they are likely already cooperating with the prosecutors.
Yeah, whoever they are, you know Bob Mueller knows who they are, and you know they know Bob Mueller knows who they are. But if I could make a quick point about David Pecker, a really interesting and underreported part of the information, the statement of facts that he pleaded to, is that in 2015, a year before this all goes down, there's an agreement with Pecker and AMI to handle the problems and the hush agreements that would be necessary. Arguably, that will be the beginning of the criminal conspiracy here. It actually starts with a approach from AMI to say, we know this is coming and we're ready with our dump and kill tools to handle the hush agreements when they become necessary. So that puts Pecker really in the hot seat.
Barbara McQuaid, that's such an important point that Harry made. I noticed that when I was reading it, I didn't highlight it the way Harry just did, and I'm so glad he did, because this introduces an element of premeditation, and rather distant premeditation, from the events that actually erupt the next year in 2016 with the two women who created the dynamics that forced or encouraged, I should say, Donald Trump and Michael Cohen and others in the campaign to commit this crime. And so it wasn't something that was suddenly upon them and these inexperienced people just kind of frantically tried to put something together that could protect the candidate. This was something planned. This was a premeditated, planned criminal plan.
Yeah, it has all the earmarks of a conspiracy, an agreement to commit a crime and then an overt act, and then they pull the trigger as the election approaches, very close to the election. And so anybody who was involved in the agreement to violate the campaign finance laws, even if they did nothing more than agree, could be on the hook here as long as someone performed an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. And we know that there were many overt acts in these payments and the financial transactions that went along with them. And so anybody who was part of that agreement could be guilty of conspiracy that likely includes all of these people who are identified sort of by code name only in the current charging documents, but whose identities will become known over the coming months. It may be that some of those people are already cooperating, and it may be that President Trump himself is one of those co-conspirators.
And David, the president now saying that I talked about this. I talked about the payments. In his answer to Fox News today, he says something to the effect that I tweeted about the payments. That was something that only happened after Rudy Giuliani had that extraordinary moment on TV where he blurted out Donald Trump's involvement in the payments, not long after Donald Trump on Air Force One had denied any knowledge of the payments.
Well, Donald has told so many lies here about so many things that I don't think he could keep them straight. I can't keep them straight without a written list. And and there are problems, going beyond this. I think it's very significant that Michael Cohen was served with a subpoena about the Trump Foundation matters, which also can involve criminality by Donald Trump and his family. And he immediately responded to that subpoena to the State Department of Taxation and said, gee, I want to tell you everything that I can. And which, by the way, we're very glad to see at DC Report, because 9 weeks ago, we're the ones who said they need to do a criminal investigation of the Trump Foundation.
And Ron Klain, the Congress now wants to hear more, possibly from Michael Cohen. The Senate Intelligence Committee does. Lanny Davis said Michael Cohen, as far as he knows, is willing to testify to Congress. Not only that, there's a report today that Michael Cohen himself responded to a contact from the New York State Attorney General that was interested in hearing what he might know about the Trump Foundation and things that the New York State Attorney General is investigating. So Michael Cohen, as we see him now, appears to be it's to get out there and testify about Donald Trump.
That's right, Lawrence, and it's important to remember that, though it sounds kind of technical, the significance of this New York State Attorney General investigation you just mentioned and that David Cay Johnston just mentioned is this. It's an investigation in which Donald Trump's pardon power has no power. He cannot pardon state crimes. So if Donald Trump goes over the top here and starts pardoning everyone, the New York State Attorney General's investigation is going to continue. It's an investigation that can send people to jail, and it's an investigation that Donald Trump can obstruct. That's why it's so important.
Barbara McQuaid, Ron Klain, Harry Litman, David K. Johnston, thank you for starting us off tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.